Okay, so now let's focus on how Daphne discusses a difference within their reasoning. Notice how even if you have opposing conclusions, you can still find stuff to talk about. Even though the students have opposing conclusions, she was able to find in their reasoning things to talk about in terms of a similarity. Also, keep in mind that this is just an example. There are all kinds of things that I could have done with respect to showing a similarity. And in fact, I was torn between another strategy that I wanted to take, focusing on some of the same content and some of different content, where I wasn't going to really focus on science at all. So just keep that in mind that this particular example is not a complete template. The only thing that it shows you is how the generic moves are made. Making a claim about a similarity or difference in bold, and then showing evidence, presenting evidence from each response in support of that claim in bold, and then unpacking and elaborating on how the evidence shows what you say in bold is true, or at least plausible. So that's what you take away from this. It could be that you could do something like this, but of course it depends on the topic that you have and what your peer said, and what you said that determines what you can do. Okay, so now notice how we're going to focus on a difference, right? So you're thinking, well, if I have to quote evidence from both responses to show how they're different, how am I going to do that? Well, let's take a look at an example. So some of what I focused on above can also be used to support my claim that there is a major difference with respect to our reasoning. So what I want you guys to know or get from this is that it might be possible for you to develop two full paragraphs, one on a similarity, one on a difference, using the same two quotes, okay? If you do that, just make sure that when you do your second argument, that you just acknowledge that you're going to be using the same quotes, and then just remind the reader, your peer, what quotes you're working with. So then just recite them, and just say, hey, I'm going to be using the same quotes. Or in this example, you might decide to use just one of the same quotes that you did in the first paragraph. So that's definitely something possible, and that can be interesting as well, because you've got to consider this, and of course you know this, but just to emphasize the point, whether or not your arguments are very similar or very different, whatever you quote for a similarity, right? Even if you came to the same conclusion and have the same angle in terms of arguing for that same conclusion, you don't have exactly identical responses. That would mean that one of you copied from the other person, or that you both copied from someone else. So even when you're arguing for similarity, you're not going to be exactly identical to each other. And that's another mistake that some students make. They'll be like, well, we basically said the same thing, the same conclusion. We kind of focus on the same thing in our reasonings. Therefore, there's not much else to say. And that's simply not true. There's always going to be some differences, no matter what kinds of similarities you note, because you each wrote for your conclusion from your own perspective in your own way. Okay, so then we've got, as cited in my discussion of a similarity, look at how nice that is. They're acknowledging and pointing back to the fact that they've already used a quote that they're about to use, but they're reminding the reader of what that quote is, which is good, because look, all this discussion happened after quoting themselves. So they're reminding the reader of what quote it is that they're going to be working with from before. So then again, they have, I note how, should have a comma there. There have been various test studies and experiments that have tried to prove claims to be true. I took out a word, or Daphne took out a word there. So when you take out some words within a statement, you can do dots. Just make sure that any words you take out do not lead to the distortion or misrepresentation of what your peer said. I took out a word that does not change the nature of what is being said. It's just that I wanted the student, or my reader, Jennifer, to focus on other stuff in the statement. So just be careful with that if you do that. So a new statement I wish to focus on from your response. So notice that. So she's making sure that the reader knows that even though she's using the same statement from her own response, she's letting Jennifer know that she's going to pull a new statement from what Jennifer wrote. And so she said, and she even gives a little context, which is fine, which you present immediately after your definition reasons. So giving a little bit of context is fine, but notice that she's not going into the definitions themselves. She's giving a little bit of context in her setup to introducing the conclusion. Is as follows. Look at the good punctuation used here. or proper. It is possible to set up experiments and complete research to determine the validity of each conflicting claim about wearing masks. Okay, so now notice again, look at all the time she spends unpacking. This is what is partly, this partly explains why this is considered, like, let's just say you had to only write one paragraph, that this would be outstanding. She's really using a lot of intellectual perseverance to work through the complexity of their arguments, the concepts used to really tease out what it is that she wants to say and use in support of what she has in bold in conjunction with the evidence she offers from the text. She says, later in your argument, you flesh out this possibility. So she's focusing on, she's unpacking now what Jennifer was talking about, right? When she said, it is possible to set up. So now she's unpacking that quote. Later in your argument, you flesh out this possibility is within the realm of science. Via evidence, one can use in arguments to establish the truth of a claim. That is, when it comes to mask wearing and the virus. So notice that she is not claiming a whole other sentence or statement. She's paraphrasing what she said. She's doing a little bit of interpretation of how she fleshes out this idea of a possibility in a later statement. So remember, I don't want you to quote from more than one statement. And I already went over the difference between a statement and a sentence and warned you about that in a previous video going back to the Unit 1 lessons on arguments and statements. So she then goes on to say, as such, the language and tone of your reasoning shows you are confident and optimistic that science can prove a given claim about mask wearing is true. So notice she's drawing a conclusion, right, about what she is seeing in the response from Jennifer. So she's offering an interpretation, but it's not just one just based merely on opinion or guessing, right? She's saying as such, in other words, I'm going to offer you an interpretation that is also a conclusion of what's going on in your response, your thinking, your disposition, your psychology. And so she says, as such. Notice that she's still focused on the text, the language and tone of your reasoning. In other words, the words that she uses and how she uses those, how Jennifer uses those words to convey what she thinks. Then she goes on to say, note how I talk about the results of tests, studies, and experiments being almost always conclusive, going on to, at least implicitly, so yes, you can bring up things that you think are implied in your response or your peer's response when arguing for or elaborating on how there is a similarity or a difference. Point out that the developments in reality have called into questions claims made in light of previous research, studies, tests, and experiments. Daphne never really comes out and says this. She implies that there have been studies and tested and experiments that claim one thing about mask wearing. She never says that, but she implies it when she says that there have been events in reality that have called things into question, right? So as such, so again, she's drawing a conclusion, right? And she says, I argue that. So as such and I argue that are conclusion indicators. The language and tone in my reasoning shows that there's another conclusion indicator that I have some doubt or at least call into question the ability of science to prove which claims about mask wearing are true. So nowhere in the original arguments do Jennifer or Daphne say, I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful that, I'm optimistic about science proving things. Nowhere in the arguments do you see anybody saying, I doubt and call into question science. What's going on here is interpretation that is connected to, tied to text-based evidence, first presented within particular statements at the beginning of a paragraph, and then as those statements are unpacked in relation to other statements and claims and words that are used. So this is showing you how you can interpret something based on textual evidence in support of a conclusion in bold. So, and notice, so then we go on and she says, Daphne says, to the extent that my argument does show attention to scientific inquiry, what's really cool is that she's pulling in something from here to build the case for a difference. You don't necessarily have to do that. It's just going to depend on what you actually say and what your peer actually says and the angle proven. Again, these are just examples. To the extent that my argument does show attention to scientific inquiry, I am further led to believe the following, another conclusion indicator. So this is a lot of the times when you're doing this kind of work, you are really constructing what I earlier called in Unit 1 complex arguments. You're arguing for a conclusion as a step toward your main point, your main conclusion. So a lot of the times, whether you intend to or not, or as we see Daphne doing here with her conclusion indicators, she is first arguing for like what we could call a minor conclusion as a step or en route to her main conclusion. So again, she says, while my reasoning appears, look at that hedge, that's nice. She's not saying that you have to 100% believe her or it's absolute or anybody can see this. She's saying it appears, but she's saying it appears with reason, given her evidence, given her discussion, given her argument, to reflect some form of epistemological skepticism. Your reasoning appears to reflect epistemological empiricism. Now, again, she could go on to elaborate and cite from the Smart Book reading what these positions are. She could say she could define epistemology. She could, quote the definition for empiricism and for skepticism. That would be getting into a whole second paragraph. If she were to do that, she would end this paragraph here and then she would start a new paragraph. But then it starts to turn into an essay, and that's not what we're doing here. So I'm okay with her not getting into the meaning of epistemological skepticism or epistemological empiricism. Another thing to note is that with this example, I'm not saying that, for example, if you're now about to talk about how your view on free will and wearing a mask compares to what a peer had to say, I'm not saying that you have to go back to the Smart Book and show or make claims about you or your peer and the metaphysical views or any view for any chapter or topic that we might be covering is reflected in a given reasoning. Here's a warning though. If you do decide to do that, make sure that you do not misrepresent something that you read about. Do not misrepresent or say something inaccurate about a theory or a thinker or distort them. Okay, so be really careful. However, if you do that, I might give you some extra points for doing so. Okay, so given that we learned that those two theories have different views about the origin, nature, and possibility of knowledge, so far she hasn't distorted anything, it is no surprise that we have opposing conclusions on the respective topic in the context of mask wearing and the spread of COVID-19. So what's really interesting here is that, she didn't have too much room left to get more into this, but it's a nice way to wrap up, how different they are. So she established the difference once she talked about how her view is optimistic, how Jennifer's view is optimistic and hopeful about what science can prove. And once she, showed that she was the opposite, that she was doubtful, calling into question what science can prove. So that was sufficient, there, at least a B level response, B plus, maybe an A minus. But then she goes on to connect what she has talked about to further emphasize the difference, like a deeper basis for the difference, like a more ultimate different set of assumptions or presuppositions or theory that is present, whether or not the speakers or writers, whether or not Daphne or Jennifer knew about it at the time they were constructing the response. She's showing that there was some kind of epistemology at play in their responses. So interestingly enough, she could have just focused on making the claim that she could have started, with the evidence and then said, argued for this dead. She could have taken out the stuff about hopeful and not hopeful and doubting, and she could have focused on this instead and given definitions, but she still would have had to connect the definitions for empiricism and skepticism and epistemology to what they actually say in the quotes. So there's a way that Daphne could have, changed the focus a bit in this paragraph. So yeah, if you want to, you can show how, for example, as a similarity, you could show how you and your peer both reflect a particular theory. But again, you have to be really careful because you can't misrepresent the theories or the lessons from the Smart Book. So do that only if you know that you, it's not that you just feel confident, because that's not enough. You can feel confident about something that you don't really understand, but you have to be careful not to misrepresent the theory and know how to integrate evidence from the book about the theory to make your case and connect it to what you each actually said. And you can use that to show a similarity or difference. We both reflect the same theory about this, or we show different theories with respect to this.